A state university in Chicago could close, and bickering over the state budget goes on. We'll talk about it next on Capitol View. Welcome to Capitol View, the program where we talk about state issues, sometimes federal issues, and how they just might affect your life. I'm Bernie Schoenburg from the State Journal-Register. Well, there's not a lot going on, but there are important things going on. We'll talk about that. With me to talk about what's going on in state government in particular, Brian Mackey is back from Illinois Public Radio here in Springfield. Brian, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Bernie.
And Patrick Yeagle, reporter with Illinois Times, the Springfield Weekly. Welcome back, Patrick.
Good to be here.
Okay, when I earlier opened the show, I talked about a state university in Chicago. It's actually Chicago State University that their administration put out the word early in the week, turn in your keys soon if you work here. We want to protect our buildings if and when we close as early as, I guess, the end of April. Then they rescinded the order saying, let's just find out where the keys are so we'll know at the right time. What's going on, Brian?
Yeah, the great marker of bureaucratic prowess is how many keys you have or how few, right? Because if you're at the top, you never have to unlock a door. Anyway, basically, Chicago State has been one of the universities hardest hit by the fact that Illinois does not have a budget in place, any funding for any state funding for higher education since July 1st of last year. Chicago State has put out layoff notices to every single one of its employees.
Something like 900 people?
Yeah, from the president down to the janitors, presumably. And so this was sort of the next step in that process. As you mentioned, they sort of walked it back because colleges are walking a very fine line now. On the one hand, they want to sound the alarm so that state legislators and the governor realize that there's a real danger of collapse here. On the other hand, they're trying to recruit students still. And so who's going to want to sign up for classes at Chicago State in the fall when you could potentially have the school closing? I mean, there are other opportunities in the Chicago area. There are plenty of other institutions of higher education for people to consider. So it's a delicate balancing act that they're trying to do.
It is, and Patrick, I know you were at a press conference in Springfield this week where the governor was, and he said he was just outraged that stuff like this is going on.
Right. It honestly came across a little bit as crocodile tears because I'm not assigning blame to one side or the other, but the General Assembly passed a budget. He vetoed it, saying that the General Assembly's budget was unbalanced, but so was his alternative. So, I mean, he had to know this was coming, and everybody's known this has been coming for a long time. So it's no surprise, and I don't think that he's as torn up about it as he pretends to be.
Well, he says this a lot, and what's interesting is, and as Brian mentioned, Chicago State is in perhaps more dire a situation than in some. There have been layoffs, or at least layoff notices. I think layoffs at Eastern and Western.
Yeah, definitely a lot of layoffs at Eastern. I want to say more than 100.
Yes.
Civil service people, including as I remember at the time, the person who was announcing this said, these are people who have health problems and kids who are going to school that they're trying to pay for. Sometimes they're a married couple, so both of them were getting laid off. I mean, this is really beginning to affect people, and we haven't even talked about the social service providers that have closed down programs, laid people off. These are people that, the state used to take care of. There used to be a department on alcoholism, and the state would take care of people who had addictions and people with disabilities and mental health problems, and we made a decision.
Yeah, we had more institutions.
Yeah, we did, and we made a decision a couple of decades ago to basically outsource those services, and we instead contracted with these private groups. Many are affiliated with churches, charitable organizations, and we're not paying them. It's been months since we've paid them. A lot of them tried to continue providing these services. Some of them still are, but others have had to say, we just can't afford it, and so they've shut their doors, they've stopped taking new patients, or they've closed altogether. So, I mean, there just continues to be this ongoing sort of a stealth shutdown, right? Because in Washington, when the government shuts down, it's pretty obvious. They put up barricades around the monuments and people can't, you know, the tourists get locked out. There's a lot of great visuals.
At least that's the way it happened last time.
Right, right. Here in Illinois, there's this, it's been much more selective and quiet. So state police are still patrolling the roadways. Meanwhile, the people who provide the gasoline for state police cars presumably are not getting paid, right?
Yeah,
so
well,
it's a very secretive, kind of selective shutdown.
Well, and I was just going to make one more point about the universities. The richer universities, like the University of Illinois, those that get a lot of grant money, They are not in as dire straits. They are continuing to operate on their reserves or whatever, which of course makes people like the governor, who wants to cut higher education, even in his proposed budget, by 25% or more in the past 2 years, says, they've got so many administrative levels, et cetera. But the richer universities or more established, or with a greater donor base, because they've had so many graduates go on to great things in industry and donate a lot of money, they're doing better and they're continuing to operate. And then, of course, there's the MAP grants, which have not yet been funded. I guess, did the legislature pass a bill to fund the MAP grants that the governor vetoed or said he will veto? But he clearly didn't like what the legislature did in pushing forward that program, which is more than 125,000 students, I think, who get about $4,000 a piece for school. So all of that is coming together, and we'll see, and Brian, you are right. Anyway, the governor at this event last week, which was at a statewide central computer center, so there was a big buzz in the background. I'm sure the radio people didn't like it. But he was complaining again that, well, after the primary, which the governor, by the way, spent millions of dollars through he and his friends to try to get some people either elected or not, and it went the wrong way in a couple of key races, even though some of their favorite people in primaries won in Republican primaries. Says that won't change any of the policy, but he spent all that money and said, my people reached out to Speaker Madigan after that, we should have a meeting one-on-one, because I don't think Madigan works well in groups. And Speaker Madigan, of course, Mike Madigan of Chicago, the Democrat in charge of the Illinois House. And the governor says, but we haven't heard. I'm available 7 days a week, anywhere he wants to meet, but we haven't heard. And then Steve Brown, who is Madigan's spokesman, has said, there was never a request for a one-on-one meeting. A staffer said, let's get dinner and let's talk about things like a meeting with our bosses, and that dinner never happened. And the governor's been saying that at various locations around the state for more than a week. And how did that come off, Patrick?
Again, it comes off as a little bit disingenuous. I mean, he said that something along the same lines right after he was elected, that I reached out to the legislative leaders, on the Democratic side and said, let's hammer something out.
Yeah, he actually said he called them after he won. Yeah.
And turns out that didn't actually happen. So is this a repeat? I mean, kind of seems like it.
I will say I do think I can share some of the governor's pain on dealing with the speaker. We've heard reports that at some of the joint meetings, the speaker sat there literally silently. He didn't say a word.
Yeah.
And it's
the
hard.
leader Regonio, the Republican leader in the Senate, has said that Mike Madigan never says anything, and Madigan's like, I listen.
Yeah, that's what he said.
At a press conference, he said, I listen. And of course,
right.
He's being frustrating, and perhaps from his position of strength, which the governor's people talk about a lot. Mm-hmm. He's in control of everything. We can't do anything without the speaker. Yeah. He has to compromise. Speaker says, these are non-budget issues that you want. So where are we? We're the same place we were 10 months ago.
And I do think that the key point is whether, who called whom, how are they negotiating with each other. I think the key thing to remember here is that they're not meeting. And that is just stunning. If you're somebody who is counting on a state service because you have an autistic child or any of the other myriad things that the state does that it's not doing, maybe your student gets one of these MAP grants that's not being funded we talked about, it's mind-blowing that they're just not even negotiating to solve this problem. It's like they don't want to see a budget passed.
Well,
ever.
And I mean, at the very core of it are some very serious ideological divides, on workers' comp and, education funding and all sorts of stuff that, you're not going to have this side selling out their base for the other side.
Right. Of course, what the governor wants is pro-business reforms.
Right.
You've got to make the state grow, which, of course, people who are critical of the government will say, well, businesses aren't coming to Illinois now and students are leaving partly because of this budget impasse. Right. But he says he wants term limits, which won't take effect for years, but he says that will show people we're going in the right direction. Remap reform, the same thing, for fair districts to be mapped out and not let one party or the other control them as we have. Also, he wants local governments to be able to determine those issues on which it will collectively bargain with their employees. The Democratic legislature, through Mike Madigan and I believe Cullerton as well, President Cullerton of the Senate, have both indicated that goes against their core beliefs. They're not going to do it. They have large majorities of Democrats, but Governor Rauner is a Republican governor. That's what he wants, and he wants these changes to take effect. And he says it's worth it to wait. Whereas Madigan and Cullerton are apparently think they're not giving in to those things, so nothing is happening. And that's where we are.
Yeah, I mean, this has been brewing in truth for decades. It's just kind of all coming to a head now at once because all these issues that have been simmering and festering for so long, now we have a Republican who will not bend and a Democratic legislature that will not bend.
Yeah, of course,
And-
they all say they're open to compromise. I mean,
Well,
the
sure.
Democrats say, well, we voted for property tax freezes 12 or 13 times in the House, but they don't include the collective bargaining part of it that the governor wants, so he says they've never voted on my bill. And whereas the Governor Rauner says, well, I'm not for right to work anymore, I took that off the table. But he still wants these things that affect unions that are not going to pass, apparently.
Yeah, and I do think there's another interesting aspect to this. The governor this year he's decided to take a different approach about the education funding bill.
Yes.
That is the one piece of the state budget that he actually signed. The Democrats passed a number of budget bills dealing with various areas of state government, one for elementary and secondary education, high schools.
I
one
believe
for
with no Republican
colleges.
votes because they weren't initially on it.
Right, yeah.
The Democrats
I mean,
passed this unbalanced budget.
Right. The Democrats passed they admitted it was, I think, $3-4 billion out of balance, and that came a couple of months after the governor had proposed his own wildly out of balance budget.
Well, there was $2 billion from a pension plan that had to go through the courts, so it was never
Right.
going to be there. Right. It was fictitious money.
Nobody was really passing honest or proposing honest budgets last
Or
year.
so we say. Yes.
So,
anyway.
so that's my analysis. I'll own that. But so the governor did sign the schools budget. Schools opened, and I think now he's going to be faced with the prospect this year. He's asked for a so-called clean education funding bill, because I think that a lot of people considered, well, maybe it would be a pressure point last year. If the schools can't open because the state doesn't have a budget for that, then suddenly people, everyday people who don't really pay a lot of attention to state government might start to notice that things were kind of dysfunctional
when
in
they have
Springfield.
to have their kids at home
When
all
they have
day.
to figure out something to do with their kids for potentially weeks at a time.
Right.
So now the governor has asked for a clean education funding bill because he doesn't want that pressure point this year. And it occurs to me that what the Democrats are really asking for is a clean overall budget. They kind of want the same thing just for the entire budget, right? The governor says, don't play any tricks. Let's just talk about the budget for education and pass that. And what the Democrats are saying is, let's put these pro-business measures you want, some of which I think the Democrats would ultimately agree to. They've agreed to similar things in the past.
Like workers' compensation
Workers'
reform,
compensation.
which they did some of in 2011.
Sure, even the Democrats even did pass some bills that made the trial lawyers very angry a decade ago. The courts later struck those down, but I think the Democrats have shown in the past a willingness to anger the trial lawyers. They've even angered unions. They've done things that really irritated the Chicago Teachers Union a few years ago.
Well, Pat Quinn was booed off the stage at the State Fair
Right.
by unions a few years ago, and that's one reason Governor Rauner is Governor Rauner.
Yeah.
Because so many union members were angry
About the
Pat
pension
Quinn.
plan
Exactly.
and not paying the raises that they still haven't gotten.
So, the Democrats have shown a willingness. What they say is kind of the key thing is that it's almost like a hostage taking. They don't want to deal with the budget as an afterthought to these. They don't want to, the governor is saying, pass these things first, term limits, redistricting changes that you mentioned, then we can talk about the budgets. And I think the Democrats don't want to establish the precedent of saying, because every year then the governor could say, well, here's another couple
But on
of
his
things.
clean funding for education bill, the governor says, I don't want it being held hostage. I don't want the school kids, he uses the word hostage too, to be held hostage to a budget with, because the Democrats are pushing also, some of them. Senator Andy Menard from Macoupin County is a key figure in this. Change the funding formula to get more money to the schools that need it most, rural, poor schools. The city of Chicago would probably get some more also, which of course, so the governor calls that a bailout for the city of Chicago, and says no school district should lose, let's just add more money, get up to the foundation level for everybody, even though we have wildly different amounts that go per student in different districts. Smaller districts, $7,000, suburban districts like $30,000 per kid. And someone like Menard says, if you throw more money at it, you're just throwing money at a system, throwing gasoline on the fire. Governor says, let's do that first. And I'm all for a new funding plan, the first big change in 20 years, but we've got to pass a budget first and make sure the school's open on time. So it is, they're talking past each other.
Basically.
Very much. Just a lot of brinksmanship and a lot of, they're using the same arguments against each other now, right? The governor says, I want a clean education funding bill. The Democrats are essentially saying, we want a clean overall budget bill. The governor is saying, you can't hold the education budget hostage, whereas the Democrats are saying, Governor, you're holding human services and higher education hostage to the rest of your agenda. So,
At the same time, we still don't have a renewed contract with AFSCME, American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, represents 38,000, maybe 40,000 state employees. Governor has been at loggerheads with that union all along. One thing that might have kind of change the dynamic is if the U.S. Supreme Court had acted as it was expected to on a decision that came out of a California teachers union and a case of someone who didn't want to pay. She was a teacher, but she didn't believe in the union's political activity. She thought the union's activity was really all political, which is kind of what the governor believes about these things because they're always dealing with government budgets. And she didn't want to have to pay dues, even the fair share dues, if that's a little reduced amount, I think, to help the union do its work when she didn't like its work and didn't want to be a member. Now, the U.S. Supreme Court was expected, through their arguments, to side with the forces that said you shouldn't have to pay dues if you're not a member. But with the death of Justice Scalia, it turned out to be a 4-4 decision. He was going to be one of those votes against the union side. 4-4 let the lower court ruling stand, so that doesn't now change the dynamics in Illinois because Governor Rauner has also wanted to stop paying the employees from having to pay fair share. He calls them unfair share dues, I think. But now that he doesn't have a Supreme Court case behind him because the Supreme Court went that way.
Yeah, it seems like the governor could have, even though he has been so far unsuccessful in eliminating these fair share dues, which he likes to call unfair share dues.
He did call this he called it a tragedy that the U.S. Supreme Court made this decision.
He was almost about to sort of accidentally get a victory if the U.S. Supreme Court had gone the way people expected it to, right? Because this presumably would have eventually led to a significant weakening of the unions here in Illinois.
Sure, if you don't have to pay and your family budget is squeezed, you might not pay.
A lot of people choose not to, and that certainly is what we saw happen in Wisconsin when the Republican governor wanted to do the same thing and had a compliant Republican legislature to help him do it. Obviously, here in Illinois, we have a Republican governor who wants to do that in a very strong Democratic legislature that doesn't want him to. So the governor almost had a victory handed to him on this topic. And as you said, the U.S. Supreme Court's the death of Justice Scalia means that they did not rule the way a lot of people had expected him to. So now who knows? The court will presumably I've heard that they're going to try and file a motion to reconsider the court's decision. Maybe they'd hold this case, or they'll look for, I'm sure the forces that want to decimate the funding source for government employee labor unions are going to continue trying
I think the other way to say that is to provide freedom of speech to people who don't want to give money to the union.
That's another way to say it. But the end result is that government employee unions would have a lot less money to be politically active.
Right.
And they're going to continue fighting, and there's a case.
Has its own case that's
the governor was sort of told it's not appropriate for you to be a part of it, but that case is still progressing with some of his allies.
And it's worth noting that the governor had his own kind of idea in Illinois to create, right-to-work zones, local areas where basically municipalities and counties could say, no fair share fees within our area.
Right, yeah, and you don't have to join.
Right.
Yeah,
and that doesn't seem to have gone anywhere, so.
As I remember the Tribune story, I think he made 63 stops or something on that tour. Mm-hmm. He's been doing the recent tour talking about schools and business and reforms we still need, which really in his mind he says he's asking for less, but it's a lot of the same stuff, even post-election. So we'll see where that goes. As long as we're talking about the Supreme Court, Merrick Garland is the judge that President Obama put forward to replace Justice Scalia. We know that top Republican leaders in the Senate who control, in the U.S. Senate, have said, Mitch McConnell has said, we're not going to even give him a hearing. But Mark Kirk of Illinois, who is in a tough battle with Tammy Duckworth himself to keep his Senate seat this year, was the first Republican senator to meet with Merrick Garland. I saw some pictures on TV, and there were a bunch of cameras. This is a big news. What do we get out of this?
I honestly, I wouldn't tie it to the fact that he's running for re-election against, Tammy Duckworth. I'd say probably, he has a reasonably good rapport with basically moderate, causes.
Yeah, I think he also knows he's in a pretty democratic state and he's running for re-election this year. But
absolutely. Yeah. So, I'm not super surprised he's never been, on the far right of his caucus. So, one thing I would say though is that his, I don't know if you want to call it, not a rebellion, that's probably too strong of a word, but his really going against the party line really doesn't do anything toward pushing that, the Senate to consider that
unless it
nomination.
becomes a chorus, but I don't know.
Yeah,
how that goes.
I guess I'm a little more cynical, Pat, than you are maybe about
Mackey, cynical?
Hard to believe, but I mean, I think that it's pretty clear that the senator is in a very tough re-election battle this year, and certainly the Duckworth campaign, his Democratic opponent this fall, did not waste any time in saying it's not enough to just meet with him. You need to push your leadership to actually have a vote. And I think a lot of observers have said, the Republicans will say, look, Joe Biden made a comment 10, 20 years ago that, I hope the president doesn't put somebody up in the last year of his term, even though there was no vacancy at the time.
Some McConnell called it the Biden rule.
Right. So they're kind of turning this around. Yeah. This is really a sort of a stunning, unprecedented step in Washington, I think, and it's not necessarily surprising given how polarized and partisan and rancorous things have been in Washington, D.C. But it is quite a departure, and I think we're going to continue to expect to see the Democrats try to make a lot of hay about it, especially in states with moderate voting populations where Republicans are going to be on the defensive.
And part of me wonders whether the Senate's reluctance to vote or to consider this nomination is based solely on their opposition to Obama or based on any part of Garland's record.
Yeah.
I mean, from what I've read, he seems like a pretty middle-of-the-road judge. He's not going to be reliably liberal or reliably conservative. So, he might end up like a Kennedy, for example.
Right, and there's some question as if the Republicans lose the presidential election, would the Republican Senate then want to put this guy in before a Democratic president comes in and nominates?
Sure.
There's a couple of 3 weeks in
we'll
there
have
where
to see.
yeah.
I will point out that the Mark Kirk people love to say that Tammy Duckworth used to work for this other person who's been involved in court action this week, which is Rod Blagojevich, because she was, of course, director of Veterans, the State Department of Veterans Affairs. Is that the State Department name for
Illinois
Blagojevich,
Department,
Illinois Department of Veterans Affairs. Anyway, Rod Blagojevich, the U.S. Supreme Court refused to hear his further appeal. Now, he had been convicted on, I believe it's 18 counts, and 5 were vacated. He wanted the rest to be looked at because he pretty much thinks he didn't do anything wrong as he's serving his 14-year prison sentence, which is a lot. He served 4 years, I think, so far in Colorado. But it's clear, and the U.S. Attorney's Office in Chicago said they won't retry the 5 counts that were sent back to court. And so those are basically dismissed, and Judge Yeagle, James Yeagle, who actually used to run the state police and the Department of Revenue and the Jim Thompson administration for old folks, will resentence him June 30th, and we don't know if he'll just re-up the 14 years or possibly take some time off. Do we want to speculate on what a judge will do? I don't know.
I don't make any predictions, but I did this week to have a conversation with Natasha Korecki, who's a Politico reporter. She covered the Blagojevich trial.
And wrote a book about it.
And literally wrote the book,
right.
or a book, on the Blagojevich trial, only in Chicago. And she said that people
That was the name of the book, Only in
Chicago.
Chicago.
Yes,
That's right.
yes. Just thought I'd give her a little plug. She said that people come up to her all the time and say, gosh, that was such an excessive sentence. You think 14 years, people don't get 14 years for holding up a bank with a gun, necessarily. And so, I mean, certainly what the governor did was terrible and wrong and awful, but I mean, George Ryan was also a corrupt governor. He got 6 years. So I think there's a lot of people out there who think it's possible that this 14-year sentence could be reduced. I mean, from the little that we've heard out of prison, former Governor Blagojevich has been, been fairly
teaching other people,
teaching Civil
calling
War
his family every day,
and so I mean, I don't think there's a lot of sympathy out there among everyday Illinoisans for this guy. He certainly did not make a lot of friends in the state, but I think there is thought that there's at least a possibility that he could get some time shaved off the 14-year sentence.
Well, we'll see where that goes. I don't know. Yeah, Blagojevich he wasn't exactly a beloved figure in Springfield because he never lived here, right? Right, Patrick?
Well, and there is a large segment of people, especially those of us who watch the State House, on a regular basis, who have seen the things that basically the consequences of some of his decisions throughout the years in office that the state is still paying for. like.
Well, he
none of
expanded
that table.
he brought in all kids, which he got
Sure,
the legislature to
sure.
do. He put a lot of people on Medicaid and lowered the bar, which
Sure.
is kind of the opposite of what's been happening in this administration, without the state having money to pay for a
Sure,
lot of that.
sure.
And he borrowed $10 billion for the pension fund, and then
Right.
used some of that for operating money, as I recall.
Yeah, and remember the
And
the
so that's
flu
one reason the
vaccines that he bought and-
pension debt, the long-term debt, has ballooned.
I think that's such a great point, Pat, and I'm really glad you made it, because I think that Blagojevich's real legacy is not his corruption.
Right.
It's the fact that he refused to balance revenue and spending, right? He would not cut, and he would not agree to raise taxes. His big thing was on Mr. No Tax Increase. And Illinois just kept going deeper and deeper into debt. We took pension holidays where we didn't, quote unquote, pension
Yeah,
holidays.
and
That was
other
the
governors
euphemism.
had
Other-
underpaid
others
the
have
pension
too,
system
but I
in the
think
past,
that
too.
as much as people
Yeah.
love to focus on the corruption, Blagojevich's real legacy is fiscal disaster
Yeah.
that he helped inflict.
Brian, you wrote a story recently on Illinois Issues Online or whatever, and I guess on the radio also, kind of comparing Donald Trump and Bruce Rauner. Is that a fair comparison? What were you getting at there?
What I was getting at is, voters really have an appetite for outsiders nowadays, and they're looking for these business guy politicians. And I think that there's a real similarity in the pitch that both Governor Rauner as a candidate and now Mr. Trump, Donald Trump, are making as candidates about how, we've never been politicians and we're proud of it. We don't know how government works. They're terrible. I know how to run a business. Put me in there. And so what I tried to look at is, well, how has it gone for the first year and a few months of Governor Rauner being a businessman, trying to apply some of that mindset to government? And, people can draw their own conclusions about whether that's worked well or not. But think about that as Donald Trump is making the same sort of pitch about how great it would be to have a businessman running a political office.
Interesting. I did notice that in that story you mentioned that Rauner doesn't like swear in public and do the other things that Donald Trump
No, and
has.
I should say
some
that.
some of the things that have characterized the complete
Very
outsiderish
much, yes,
of Trump's
yes.
candidacy, Governor Rauner hasn't done those things.
And Rauner really Trump has sort of made it his role to fight the establishment, if you will, and Rauner kind of co-opted helped.
He is now the
He
leader of the
owns
Republican
coast.
Party.
Yeah,
Well,
basically, yeah. I mean, he has
Yeah.
been through his campaign funding and largesse. He is basically the driving force of Republicans
Yeah.
in Illinois.
Patrick, I don't know, the Wisconsin primary is coming up and Trump has been in the news a lot. There's still a question who the Republican nominee will be and how that will affect down ballot races in Illinois, because I know Governor Rauner, for example, he's really hoping that in November he gains seats in the legislature. But if there's a Trump at the top of the ticket, which, Illinois helped that because most voters in our own primary, March 15th, went for Trump on the Republican side. Does that affect down ballot races with all the controversy that may go with that candidate?
I would say so. Trump obviously drives voter turnout to a large extent. We saw that here in Sangamon County, where we ran out of ballots at a lot of.
Could have been for
polling places.
Bernie, but
Well, absolutely, it could have been for you. No, I'm just kidding.
No, right, yeah.
But
That other Bernie.
Trump absolutely drives a lot of voter turnout, and if that means that more of the electorate comes out during the general to vote for a Trump candidacy, then we'll certainly see that.
or to be on the other side.
Absolutely,
which I
absolutely.
think,
Yeah, and I
Trump.
yeah, and we're about out of time, but finish.
Well, I should say, there are so many Republicans who really hate Trump too, though.
Sure.
He is winning, but he's winning with a minority of the vote in his party, and so you could see that hurt him.
Absolutely.
We'll see where it goes. Brian Mackey, Patrick Yeagle, thanks for the help. Thank you for watching. I'm Bernie Schoenburg, and we'll see you next time on Capitol View.